She invented this, the motorcycle. The hitman balanced on the back seat, the gun appearing from beneath a jacket, 2 shots to the head before the engine even slows. She introduced this method to Colombia in the 1970s. She refined it. She exported it to Miami. She used it to eliminate rivals, business partners, competitors, enemies, and 3 husbands. She commissioned it with the same emotional register that other people use to order dinner. Calm, specific, final. On the morning of September 3, 2012, Griselda Blanco walked out of a butcher shop in the Belén neighborhood of Medellín carrying a bag of meat. The street was narrow, the kind of street where sound bounces off concrete walls and amplifies. The rattle of a vendor's cart, a dog barking somewhere above on the hill, the low hum of the city waking up. She was 69 years old. She was wearing ordinary clothes. She looked, by all accounts, like any other older woman in that neighborhood running morning errands. She had survived 19 years inside American federal prisons. She had survived 3 husbands, all of whom she had arranged to have murdered. She had survived the DEA, the FBI, CENTAC 26, a specialized federal task force built specifically to dismantle her organization. She had survived Jorge Rivi Ayala, her own personal hitman, who had carried out somewhere between 25 and 40 murders on her direct orders, and who had eventually agreed to testify against her in exchange for a reduced sentence. She had survived all of it. She had not survived herself. A motorcycle appeared at the far end of the street. 2 men, moving at an unhurried pace, which is the pace of people who are not worried about being stopped. The passenger's hand moved, coming out from beneath his jacket. 2 shots, both to the head. She was dead before the bag of meat hit the cobblestones. The motorcycle kept moving. It turned a corner and was gone. Nobody chased it. It was the exact same method she had invented 40 years earlier. The irony was total. The symmetry was almost architectural, as if the universe had been saving the ending, waiting for the right moment to close the loop. She had sent motorcycles to hundreds of people. Now a motorcycle had come for her. The street in Belén emptied quickly after the shots. Doors closed. Windows, which had been open in the morning heat, were pulled shut. People in that neighborhood had learned long ago how to make themselves invisible after gunfire. That, too, was something Griselda Blanco had helped teach them. February 15, 1943. A girl is born in Colombia, possibly in Cartagena, possibly in Santa Marta. The records are inconsistent. Even her birthplace is contested, which feels entirely appropriate. From the very beginning, the facts about Griselda Blanco were slippery, shifting, impossible to pin down without risk to the person doing the pinning. What is certain? She was born into nothing. Her mother, Ana Restrepo, was an alcoholic with a volatile temper and no stable income. The Colombia of 1943 was in the middle of a period historians call La Violencia, a decade-long civil conflict between liberal and conservative factions that would eventually kill somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people and displace millions more. Into this country, in this year, to this woman, Griselda arrived. When she was 3 years old, her mother moved them to Medellín. The city was already beginning its long, bloody transformation, not yet the cocaine capital it would become, but already a place where the structures of poverty and organized crime were quietly fusing together in the hillside comunas that spread across the mountains above the city center. Dense, vertical, built of whatever material was cheap or stolen. Streets too narrow for cars, which meant the police rarely came, which meant that the people who lived there governed themselves according to rules they made without outside input. Violence was one of those rules. It was the primary one. Griselda grew up in a neighborhood where the hierarchy was physical and the consequences of weakness were immediate. Her mother beat her. Her mother brought men home. What exactly happened in that apartment during those years is not fully documented, because the people who could have documented it are long dead, and because Griselda Blanco never gave an interview in which she described her childhood in any detail. What the people around her later said, the criminals, the investigators, the witnesses who knew her across multiple decades, was that she emerged from childhood with a specific quality that they struggled to name precisely. Not anger, not ambition, something colder than either. A complete absence of the normal human hesitation that precedes harming another person. She had learned, somewhere in those early years, that hesitation was the thing that got you hurt. By age 11, according to multiple accounts from people who knew her in Medellín in the 1950s, Griselda was already running small thefts in the city's market districts. Not for thrill, not for the social currency of being seen as daring. For food. She was hungry, and the markets had food, and the distance between those two facts was something she crossed without moral deliberation. She stole, she ate, she stole again. Then she did something that crossed an entirely different kind of line. The story exists in multiple versions, as all stories about Griselda Blanco do, but the core is consistent. Somewhere between the ages of 11 and 13, she kidnapped a child from a wealthier neighborhood with the intention of collecting ransom money. The plan failed. The money did not come. The police began to close in. And Griselda, a child herself, barely into adolescence, killed the kidnapped child rather than release them. Whether this story is completely accurate, partially mythologized, or significantly embellished across the decades of criminal legend building that followed, it is impossible to verify with absolute certainty. But here is what matters. The people who worked with Griselda Blanco for 30 years, the killers, the smugglers, the fixers, the men and women who spent their lives in the same world she inhabited, believed the story was true. They told it themselves. They told it as a warning to people who were considering underestimating her. That is its own kind of evidence. At 13, she ran away from home. At 16, she was working the streets of Medellín, already building a network, already learning the geography of criminal opportunity, already forming the relationships that would define the next 5 decades of her life. She met men. She assessed their utility. She extracted what they could teach her and moved on when they became liabilities. The first husband was Carlos Trujillo. She was still a teenager. He was a petty criminal who specialized in document forgery, false IDs, fraudulent papers, new identities for people who needed to become someone else. From Carlos, Griselda acquired a skill that would serve her for the rest of her life: the ability to make herself and other people disappear on paper. She learned how identity worked as a bureaucratic construct, how the same person could exist in 3 cities simultaneously under 3 different names, how the machinery of official records could be made to say whatever you needed it to say if you understood the machinery well enough. Carlos Trujillo gave her 3 sons: Dixon, Uber, Osvaldo. And then, in the way of men who made themselves unnecessary to Griselda Blanco, Carlos Trujillo disappeared from the story. By the early 1960s, Griselda had moved through multiple identities, multiple cities, and multiple criminal partnerships. She had a reputation in Medellín's underworld, not a loud reputation, not the kind built on public demonstrations of power, but the specific quiet reputation of someone who was more dangerous than they appeared. People who crossed her had a way of not being around to talk about it afterward. People who worked for her had a way of staying loyal because disloyalty was too expensive. She was in her early 20s. She had already figured out the fundamental equation of her life: that the world ran on power, that power ran on fear, and that fear was most efficiently generated not by being the biggest or the loudest, but by being the person in the room who was genuinely, convincingly, willing to go further than anyone else. She was willing. The man who would take her from Medellín to New York and ultimately to Miami was named Alberto Bravo. He was already operating a cocaine trafficking network between Colombia and the United States when Griselda met him in the late 1960s. Connected, established, moving product through a network that was crude by later standards: small shipments, unreliable couriers, enormous risk for relatively modest profit, but which functioned, which generated money, which existed at a moment when almost nobody in American law enforcement was paying attention to cocaine, because heroin was still the drug they were trained to pursue. Griselda recognized, immediately, what Alberto Bravo had and what he was missing. He had the supply chain, connections to Colombian coca paste producers, a relationship with the chemists who converted paste to powder, a route through the Caribbean into Florida and New York. What he did not have was operational sophistication. His couriers were obvious. His distribution was chaotic. His money management was almost non-existent. Product moved, cash came back, and the cash sat in boxes because nobody had figured out yet how to turn cocaine money into something the banking system would accept. She had ideas about all of that. She married him. She merged her skills with his infrastructure. And then, together, they moved to New York. New York in the early 1970s was a different city than it would become. The fiscal crisis had not yet hit, but the conditions for it were already in place. The city was hemorrhaging manufacturing jobs. The middle class was leaving for the suburbs, and the neighborhoods left behind were entering a period of abandonment and decay that would define them for the next 2 decades. The South Bronx was burning, literally. Landlords torching their own buildings for the insurance money. Block after block of urban landscape reduced to rubble. Into this city, Griselda and Alberto Bravo brought cocaine. They settled into the Colombian immigrant communities of Queens, neighborhoods dense enough to disappear in, connected enough to Medellín to maintain supply relationships, and almost entirely ignored by the NYPD, which was overwhelmed by violent crime and had not yet been trained to look for the specific signature of Colombian drug trafficking. Griselda's first significant innovation was her courier system. She recruited women, Colombian immigrant women specifically, women who could move through airports and border checkpoints without triggering the profile that law enforcement used to identify drug smugglers. In the early 1970s, that profile was almost exclusively male. Young Colombian men traveling alone, nervous, carrying too much cash. Griselda's couriers were women. Some were middle-aged, some traveled with children. They wore specially designed undergarments, brassieres, girdles, corsets, with compartments sewn into the fabric that could carry several kilos of cocaine through security without detection. The women who worked for her were not random. Griselda recruited carefully, paid well, better than any other trafficking operation in New York at the time, and enforced loyalty through a combination of financial incentive and the very clear, very well understood knowledge of what happened to people who betrayed her. Her couriers crossed the border hundreds of times before federal agents identified the pattern. By the time anyone was looking for female cocaine smugglers, Griselda had already moved on to refining the next phase of the operation. The second innovation was structural. She created what investigators later called a cellular distribution network, a system in which the people selling cocaine on the street knew only the person directly above them in the chain, who knew only the person directly above them, and so on, with Griselda at the center, but separated from every transaction by multiple layers of operational insulation. If any single point in the network was arrested, the contamination could not spread upward. The street dealer knew the block distributor. The block distributor knew the warehouse contact. The warehouse contact knew a name and a phone number that led to another name and another phone number. And at the end of that chain, invisible, was Griselda. This structure was not new in principle. Intelligence agencies had used cellular organization for decades. But nobody in American drug trafficking had applied it systematically before Griselda. She had, essentially, borrowed the organizational logic of guerrilla warfare and applied it to narcotics distribution. The New York operation grew fast. By the mid-1970s, she and Alberto Bravo were moving hundreds of kilos per month. They had distribution networks across multiple boroughs. They had a payroll that included enforcers, logistics coordinators, money handlers, and a rotating cast of lawyers who could be called at any hour. They had front businesses, a restaurant in Queens, an import-export operation, a small trucking company that generated enough legitimate revenue to explain a portion of their lifestyle without attracting the attention that pure cash accumulation would have caused. They had money in quantities that had previously been theoretical to both of them. And then Griselda discovered that Alberto was stealing from her. The amounts were significant. Investigators who later reconstructed the financial records of the operation estimated that Alberto Bravo had diverted hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly more, over a period of several years. He had done it carefully, gradually, in amounts small enough not to trigger immediate alarm. He had, apparently, believed that the complexity of their shared finances would make it undetectable. He had not understood who he was stealing from. In 1975, Griselda arranged a meeting with Alberto Bravo in Bogotá. She told him it was a business discussion, a settling of accounts. She traveled to Colombia with several armed men. Alberto arrived at the meeting location, a parking lot, with several of his own. The conversation was brief. When the shooting stopped, multiple people were dead in that parking lot. Alberto Bravo was among them. According to the account that circulated for decades in Colombian criminal circles, an account consistent enough across enough separate sources to carry significant weight, when Alberto's bodyguards scattered and he lay wounded on the ground, Griselda walked to where he was, looked at him, and shot him in the head herself. She was 32 years old. She had just killed her second husband. She was also now a fugitive in Colombia. There was one place left to go. Miami in 1978 looked like a city that had stopped paying attention to itself. The police department was underfunded, demoralized, and riddled with corruption that went deep enough that nobody was entirely sure where the rot ended. The political establishment was distracted. Cuban émigrés arriving in waves, Haitian refugees crossing open water on anything that floated. A demographic transformation happening faster than any institutional structure could absorb. The port was enormous and chronically understaffed. Thousands of containers moved through it every week, and customs had the resources to inspect perhaps 3% of them. The financial system was a labyrinth of small banks, currency exchanges, and cash-heavy businesses, car dealerships, restaurants, real estate, that could absorb enormous sums of unexplained income without anyone asking the questions they were legally required to ask. Griselda Blanco looked at Miami the way a surgeon looks at an operating table. She saw the anatomy of the place, where it was soft, where it was open, where pressure applied in the right location would produce the results she needed. She arrived sometime around 1978. She came with money from New York, connections in the Colombian trafficking world, and a reputation that preceded her in the specific circles where reputations like hers carried weight. She also came with active federal warrants, which meant she traveled under assumed names, paid cash for everything, and rotated through a series of rented properties that were never in her real name. The document forgery skills she had acquired from her first husband, Carlos Trujillo, more than a decade earlier, were now deployed in her own defense. She existed, officially, as several different people simultaneously. She also had a new partner. His name was Dario Sepulveda, younger than her, physically imposing, connected to the Colombian supply networks she needed to scale up her Miami operation. He became her third husband. She would eventually have a son with him, a boy she named Michael Corleone Blanco, after the fictional mafia heir from The Godfather. She named her son after a man who inherited a criminal empire and spent the rest of his life watching it consume everyone he loved. The name was not an accident. The Miami operation grew at a speed that, looking back, seems almost impossible to comprehend. Within 2 years of her arrival, Griselda had established a distribution network that covered all of Miami-Dade County and extended north through Broward and into Palm Beach. She had wholesale clients in Atlanta, in New York, in Los Angeles. Established traffickers who bought from her in bulk because her product was consistent, her prices were competitive, and her delivery was reliable in a way that most suppliers in that era were not. She had a money laundering infrastructure built around a portfolio of front businesses, restaurants, clothing boutiques, a small real estate operation that processed cash with enough sophistication to keep the IRS at a distance. At her peak in the early 1980s, Griselda Blanco was moving an estimated 3,400 pounds of cocaine per month into the United States. 3,400 pounds every month. month after month for years. To put that number in context, the entire DEA budget for cocaine interdiction in 1980 was approximately $86 million per year. Griselda's operation was generating somewhere between $75 and $80 million per month. She was, in a very literal sense, outspending the federal government's entire effort to stop her. Not in enforcement resources, but in the raw economic weight of what she was moving. The money required its own infrastructure. She had accountants. She had a team of lawyers on retainer. She had banking relationships maintained through intermediaries and shell companies that connected her cash to the legitimate financial system through enough layers of abstraction that direct linkage was difficult. Federal investigators who later reconstructed her finances during trial preparation described the system as genuinely sophisticated, not something improvised by a street criminal, but something designed by someone who understood how money moved through institutions and how to exploit the gaps. She had learned all of this herself. No business school, no mentor with an MBA. She had learned it by doing it, by making mistakes and correcting them, by watching what worked and scaling it, and watching what failed and eliminating it. She had the specific intelligence of someone who had never been given the luxury of theoretical knowledge. Everything she knew because she had survived the process of learning it. And running underneath all of it, financing the whole operation, maintaining the network, enforcing the contracts, violence. The violence was not incidental to Griselda's operation. It was structural. Every major trafficking organization uses violence as a tool to enforce debts, to eliminate threats, to signal to the market that certain boundaries are not negotiable. This is as true of the Medellín cartel as it is of the Sicilian mafia, as it is of any criminal organization that operates at sufficient scale. Violence is the enforcement mechanism that replaces the legal system in markets where legal recourse does not exist. What made Griselda different was not that she used violence. It was the specific way she used it. Where, when, against whom, and with how little apparent concern for the consequences. Most criminal organizations in the 1970s operated with an implicit understanding of geographic and social limits. You killed rivals. You killed people who stole from you. You killed witnesses when absolutely necessary. But you did not kill civilians. You did not conduct open warfare in public spaces. You did not bring the kind of attention that made politicians hold press conferences and federal agencies restructure their priorities. That understanding was, from Griselda's perspective, an inefficiency. She had no interest in operating within a framework designed by people who were afraid of consequences. She was not afraid of consequences. She had not been afraid of consequences since she was 11 years old stealing food in a Medellín market. The framework that other criminals respected was, to her, simply a set of constraints that she could ignore and they could not, which meant she could go further, faster, with less resistance. She went further. July 11, 1979, a Saturday, 2:30 in the afternoon. Dadeland Mall in Miami, one of the largest shopping centers in Florida, busy on a Saturday with families and teenagers and ordinary people doing ordinary things. A liquor store called Crown Liquors at the northern end of the mall. Inside, a Colombian man named Herman Jimenez Paneso and his bodyguard. Herman was a mid-level trafficker who had made the specific mistake of moving product in territory that Griselda considered hers, and who had reportedly shorted her on a payment. The details of the exact offense vary across different accounts. The response does not. A white cargo van pulled up in front of the store. Two men got out. They were carrying MAC-10 submachine guns, weapons capable of firing 1,000 rounds per minute. They were wearing Kevlar vests. They walked through the entrance of Crown Liquors and opened fire. Herman Jimenez Paneso and his bodyguard were dead before they had taken 3 steps toward the door. The shooters walked back to the van. But the van was not an ordinary van. Its interior walls had been reinforced with steel plating, a mobile armored vehicle constructed specifically for this operation, able to absorb return fire from standard law enforcement weapons. When Dade County Sheriff's Department cruisers attempted to intercept the van on the highway outside the mall, they found themselves being shot at through gun ports cut into the vehicle's side. Their bullets were doing nothing. The van drove through the police response as if it were not there. It eventually crashed on the highway. The shooters fled on foot and were never definitively identified. No one was ever charged with the Dadeland murders. But law enforcement and every criminal organization operating in South Florida knew immediately who had ordered it. The message was precise. Griselda Blanco would kill you anywhere. In a shopping mall on a Saturday afternoon with families 30 feet away. With automatic weapons and armored vehicles in broad daylight in front of witnesses. She would not wait for a quiet moment. She did not need a quiet moment. She wanted you to know there was no safe place. What followed the Dadeland massacre has been called, by every journalist, investigator, and law enforcement official who has written about it, by far the most violent period in Miami's history. The phrase they used was Cocaine Cowboys. What they meant was this. Beginning in the summer of 1979 and continuing with escalating intensity through most of the next 5 years, metropolitan Miami became a killing ground unlike anything the continental United States had experienced since the height of Prohibition. The difference was scale and brazenness. Al Capone's Chicago had gangland murders. Miami in 1979 had open warfare conducted in shopping centers, hospital parking lots, hotel lobbies, residential streets in broad daylight, and at least 2 christening parties. Bodies accumulated faster than the system could process them. The Dade County Medical Examiner's Office, the facility responsible for handling all unnatural deaths in the county, ran out of space. They rented refrigerated trucks and parked them behind the building. At the peak of the violence, those trucks held more than 30 bodies waiting for processing. The Medical Examiner's Office requested an emergency budget allocation. The county granted it. They hired additional staff. The bodies kept coming. In 1981, Miami recorded 621 murders. New York City, with a population roughly 15 times larger than Miami-Dade County, recorded 893 murders that same year. Miami was, by a significant statistical margin, the most dangerous city in the United States. Tourists stopped coming. Property values in certain neighborhoods collapsed. A cover story in Time magazine declared Miami a city in crisis. The headline read simply, "Paradise Lost." Griselda was not the only organization producing this violence. There were other trafficking networks, other rivalries, other Colombian organizations competing for market share in South Florida. But she was the one who had set the terms. She was the one who had demonstrated, with Dadeland, that the rules everyone else was operating under did not apply to her. Once she demonstrated that, everyone else had to decide whether to respond in kind or accept being at a tactical disadvantage. Most of them responded in kind. She had, in a very real sense, created the conditions for the war that followed, not just by participating in it, but by establishing a threshold of violence that made de-escalation impossible. Griselda's personal hitman during these years was a man named Jorge Ayala. She called him Rivy. He was 17 years old when he first came to work for her. He had grown up in the same world she had. Poverty, violence, the specific education that the street provides when there is no other kind available. He was, by multiple accounts including his own, not a person who needed much persuasion to commit violence. But what Griselda gave him was something more than employment. She gave him structure. She gave him the sense of belonging to something organized, purposeful, directed. She gave him a framework in which his particular skills had value and status. He was, by his own later testimony, devoted to her. In the years he worked for Griselda, from the late 1970s through the early 1980s, Rivy carried out somewhere between 25 and 40 murders. The number is imprecise because not all of his work was discovered, and because some of what was discovered could not be conclusively attributed to him. What is precise is the method. Motorcycles, almost always. 2 men, the passenger shooting, the driver already accelerating before the sound of the shot had finished echoing off the walls. She had taught him that. He was also, because she trusted him more than almost anyone else, the person who would eventually contribute most directly to her downfall. But that is later. At the peak of her power, Griselda Blanco lived in a waterfront property in Miami that cost more to maintain each month than most of her neighbors earned in a year. She drove multiple cars, rotating them for the same reason she rotated safe houses, to make herself harder to track, to ensure that no fixed pattern existed that could be used to predict her location. She wore jewelry that her personal bookkeeper later estimated at a total value exceeding $2 million. She ate at the best restaurants in Miami, usually seated with her back to the wall, facing the entrance, flanked by men who were not there for conversation. She also never slept in the same location 2 consecutive nights. Paranoia, in Griselda's case, was not a disorder. It was a rational response to her circumstances, carried to its logical extreme. She maintained at least 7 properties across Miami-Dade County simultaneously. Safe houses, rented apartments, houses held under false names, and cycled through them on a schedule that she kept entirely in her own head, sharing it with no one. She never discussed business on the telephone. All operational communication moved through physical intermediaries, runners who carried handwritten messages, face-to-face meetings in locations chosen at the last minute, a system designed to produce no electronic footprint whatsoever. She had watched what happened to people who got comfortable. Alberto Bravo had gotten comfortable and started stealing. Other traffickers she had known in New York had gotten comfortable and started talking too freely and ended up in federal custody. Comfort was the specific vulnerability she was most afraid of in herself, because she knew what it had cost other people. She ran her organization the way a field commander runs an operation behind enemy lines, with the constant assumption that the perimeter had already been breached and the enemy was already inside, and that the only defense against that reality was to make yourself impossible to locate, impossible to predict, and impossible to approach without warning. It was exhausting. It was also, for a long time, effective. The marriage to Dario Sepulveda was from its beginning a transaction as much as a relationship. He was useful to her, connected to Colombian supply networks, physically capable of the role of enforcer when she needed visible muscle, attractive enough that his presence at her side communicated a kind of normalcy she needed for certain social contexts. He gave her Michael Corleone. He moved with her through the early Miami years, when the operation was being built and the violence was escalating and every week brought new complications. But Dario had a flaw that was, in the context of a life with Griselda Blanco, fatal. He wanted out. By the early 1980s, he was asking questions about exit, about taking Michael Corleone to Colombia, away from Miami, away from the war and the bodies and the federal task forces that were now openly targeting the Colombian trafficking networks. He was not asking to betray Griselda. He was not cooperating with law enforcement. He simply wanted to leave, to take his son somewhere quieter, somewhere less likely to end with both of them dead on a Miami street. Griselda heard this as something else entirely. To a woman who had spent her entire adult life managing the risk of betrayal, who had built her entire organizational structure around the assumption that everyone was a potential threat, a partner who wanted to leave was indistinguishable from a partner who was preparing to become a liability. Dario, knowing what he knew, going somewhere she could not monitor him, potentially talking to people she could not control. The logic of her world said there was only one way to manage that risk. In 1983, Dario Sepulveda was shot and killed in Colombia. The gunman was working for his wife. Michael Corleone Blanco was approximately 3 years old. He was nearby when his father was murdered. He was returned to his mother in Miami shortly afterward. Griselda had now killed 3 husbands, or arranged the killing of 3 husbands. The distinction, from a legal perspective, mattered. From every other perspective, it did not. She had looked at 3 men who had shared her life and her bed, and in each case arrived at the same calculation, that they were more dangerous alive than dead. She had been right, probably, in each case. That was perhaps the most disturbing part. She was also, by 1983, beginning to generate a level of law enforcement attention that all her security measures and all her operational sophistication could not indefinitely deflect. The machine that would bring her down was already running. The detective who would eventually dismantle Griselda Blanco's empire did not look like the protagonist of a story about cocaine wars. Bob Palumbo was a Dade County police officer, methodical, patient, the kind of investigator who kept files on index cards before computers made that redundant, who cross-referenced witness statements by hand, who built cases the way a mason builds walls, one piece at a time, each piece load-bearing, nothing placed until the piece beneath it was solid. He had been assigned to the Colombian trafficking problem in the late 1970s, when Dadeland made it impossible for Dade County law enforcement to pretend the problem was manageable through ordinary policing. What Palumbo found when he started pulling the threads was not what he expected. He had expected, going in, to find a male-dominated hierarchy, the standard model of criminal organization that law enforcement had been trained to recognize. What he found instead was a woman at the center of everything. A woman whose name kept appearing in witness statements, in financial records, in the recollections of informants, in the organizational charts that his investigation was slowly assembling. A woman who, when he tried to locate her physically, seemed to exist everywhere on paper and nowhere in reality. Griselda Blanco was, by the early 1980s, the most wanted drug trafficker in the United States that most Americans had never heard of. The DEA knew her name. CENTAC 26, the specialized federal task force created specifically to target the Colombian networks responsible for the Miami drug wars, had her as their primary target. But she was not Pablo Escobar, whose name was already beginning to appear in American newspapers. She was not a name that had crossed into public consciousness. She preferred it that way. Palumbo's investigation proceeded through the specific, slow grind of building a federal case against someone who had spent 30 years learning how to make herself untouchable. Every arrest at the street level produced a name one step higher. Every name one step higher required its own investigation, its own cultivation of informants, its own months of surveillance and financial analysis. The cellular structure of Griselda's organization, which she had designed precisely to prevent this kind of upward penetration, did exactly what it was designed to do. It slowed the investigation to a crawl. But it did not stop it. Because the one structural weakness in Griselda's organizational design was the same weakness in every organization built on personal loyalty maintained through fear. It required Rivi. Jorge Ayala knew things that nobody else in the organization knew. He had been present at meetings that no other subordinate attended. He had carried out murders that were ordered in his direct presence, which meant he could testify not just to the killings, but to the specific words used to commission them. He knew the operational geography of the network, the safe houses, the warehouse locations, the names of the money handlers, at a level that no street-level informant could approach. He was also, by the early 1980s, increasingly isolated. The violence in Miami had created a kind of operational paranoia that spread through the entire network. Griselda trusted fewer and fewer people. She moved more frequently. She communicated less. The people around her found themselves under surveillance not just from law enforcement, but from Griselda herself. She had developed, over the course of her career, an almost clinical capacity for detecting disloyalty, and she had responded to that capacity by seeing disloyalty everywhere, even where it did not yet exist. Rivi had been loyal for years. He had killed for her without hesitation. He had accepted imprisonment on a weapons charge in the early 1980s without cooperating with the authorities, which was precisely the kind of loyalty test that Griselda valued most. He had passed every test she had given him. But loyalty, in the end, is not an infinite resource. It is generated by something, by belief, by affection, by fear, by the calculation that the relationship is worth maintaining. And when the thing generating it runs out, or is withdrawn, or becomes insufficient to compensate for the weight of what is being asked, the loyalty runs out with it. Griselda withdrew. She reduced Rivi's role. She communicated through intermediaries rather than directly. The specific intimacy of their working relationship, the closeness that comes from years of shared, violent, secret activity, was replaced by distance. And in that distance, Rivi began to reassess. The federal agents who eventually flipped him understood this dynamic. They did not approach him with threats. They approached him with an accounting. Here is what you have done. Here is what you face. Here is what cooperation looks like versus what non-cooperation looks like. The mathematics were not complicated. 25 to 40 murders, life in prison without the possibility of parole, versus a negotiated sentence with the possibility of release. He cooperated. Meanwhile, CENTAC 26 was assembling the financial architecture of the case, the part that would be hardest for Griselda to attack in court, because financial records are less vulnerable to the methods she had used to silence witnesses. The money trail, when investigators finally reconstructed it, was staggering in its scale. At various points in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Federal Reserve Bank of Miami was receiving so much cash, physical currency, actual bills, from South Florida banks that it was generating a cash surplus that had no precedent in its operating history. The Miami Fed was, in certain years, the only Federal Reserve branch in the country operating at a cash surplus rather than a deficit. Economists noticed this anomaly. They wrote papers about it. The explanation, which everyone in Miami already understood, but which took the financial system years to officially acknowledge, was cocaine money. The cocaine economy was so large, generating so much physical cash, that it was measurably distorting the monetary statistics of an entire region. Griselda's operation was a significant contributor to that distortion. The front businesses she used for laundering, the restaurants, the boutiques, the real estate entities, processed cash at volumes that no legitimate business of their size could plausibly generate. The restaurants reported revenues that implied a full house every service, 7 days a week, at prices the neighborhood would not support. The boutiques showed inventory turnover rates that defied the economics of retail. Federal investigators, working backward from the financial records, could trace the shape of the money even when they could not trace specific transactions to specific drug sales. It was painstaking work, it took years, but it built a case that was, unlike witness testimony, difficult to murder. The first thing Griselda did when she sensed the net tightening was move. She had done this before. The move from Medellín to New York, the move from New York to Miami, each relocation timed to stay ahead of consequences that were becoming unavoidable. She had a specific instinct for when a situation had passed the point of manageability, and that instinct, honed over 3 decades of operating in environments where being wrong meant being dead or imprisoned, was reliable. By 1984, the Miami federal indictments were being prepared. More than 30 people in her network were about to be charged. Griselda was the central figure in all of the charging documents. She was not in Miami when they were filed. She was in California. Irvine, California specifically. A quiet suburb in Orange County. Good schools, maintained lawns, neighbors who left for work in the morning and returned in the evening and asked no questions about the woman in the house on the corner who paid cash for everything and whose guests arrived and left at odd hours. She had established a smaller operation there, a West Coast distribution network that was profitable and, crucially, that nobody was yet looking for. She lived in Irvine under an assumed name. She drove unremarkable cars. She dressed without ostentation. She had, after 30 years of building the most visible and violent cocaine empire in American history, made herself look like a suburban housewife in Orange County. It almost worked. The DEA found her through a combination of financial intelligence, informant networks, and the specific investigative persistence that Bob Palumbo and the CENTAC 26 team had been building for years. The warrant was federal. The arrest was coordinated. On February 17, 1985, DEA agents knocked on the door of Griselda Blanco's house in Irvine, California. She answered the door. The agents who arrested her later described the moment with a consistency that suggests it genuinely surprised them. She was calm. Not the performative calm of someone trying to project control, genuinely calm in the way of someone who had been waiting for something for a long time and felt, when it finally arrived, something closer to relief than panic. She was 42 years old. She was wearing ordinary clothes. She looked, by every account, like exactly what she was pretending to be, an ordinary middle-aged woman in a suburban house in California. Inside the house, behind locked doors in the basement and a back room, agents found what she actually was: records, financial documents, code books, organizational charts, the physical archive of 30 years of cocaine trafficking. It was meticulous. It was organized. It was, in the specific way of all her work, the product of genuine intelligence applied to catastrophic ends. She was booked. She was transferred to federal custody in Miami, and the trial began the long, complicated, repeatedly interrupted process of trying to put Griselda Blanco in a cell for the rest of her life. The trial was not simple. It was never going to be simple. Griselda had spent 3 decades building a legal firewall around herself. Layers of corporate entities, layers of intermediaries, layers of operational separation that made direct evidentiary links to specific crimes difficult to establish in the way that federal prosecution requires. Her lawyers were expensive and skilled. The government's case was strong on financial conspiracy, but more complicated on the murder charges, which required witness testimony. And witness testimony, in a Griselda Blanco trial, was an inherently dangerous thing to provide. 3 witnesses who had agreed to testify against her were murdered before they reached the stand. The mechanism by which murder contracts were arranged from inside a federal detention facility was never fully established to the satisfaction of a court. What was established was that Griselda maintained communication channels with the outside, that the Bureau of Prisons had not fully closed, and that people who were preparing to testify had a way of dying before they got the chance. Federal prosecutors knew what was happening. They could not always prove it in the specific way that criminal proceedings require proof. They pressed forward anyway, because they had Rivi. Jorge Ayala's testimony was the spine of the government's murder case. He was specific. He was detailed. He could describe the meetings at which murders were commissioned, the words used, the logistics arranged, the subsequent confirmation that the contract had been fulfilled. He had personal knowledge of the organizational structure at its highest levels. His testimony, if it held, would be enough. It held. And then it was destroyed. During the course of the trial, it emerged that Jorge Ayala had been making phone calls from prison, not to family members, not to lawyers, but to female employees of the state attorney's office. Extended calls. Personal calls. Calls that were explicitly sexual in nature and that had been facilitated, apparently, by someone within the prosecution's own administrative staff. The revelation was catastrophic. The judge reviewed the situation and ruled that the relationship between Rivi and employees of the prosecuting office constituted a breach of procedure serious enough to taint his testimony. Key murder charges against Griselda were dropped. The most serious counts, the ones that would have put her away for multiple life sentences, evaporated. She was convicted on federal drug trafficking charges. She was sentenced to 20 years, which with time served and good behavior became 15, and then less. She entered federal custody as the architect of one of the most violent criminal enterprises in American history. She would emerge, eventually, as a 61-year-old woman being put on a plane to Colombia. She had beaten the murder charges. She had not beaten everything. Prison changed her. Or perhaps it revealed her, stripped away the operational context that had defined every day of her adult life and left just the person underneath, with nothing to manage and nowhere to be and no decisions to make that involved motorcycles or money or who needed to be killed before morning. She did 19 years total in federal custody across multiple facilities. She was, by all accounts from correctional officers and fellow inmates who spoke about her later, a model prisoner. Not in the performative sense of someone working the system, but genuinely compliant, quiet, unremarkable. She read. She was reportedly religious in a way that people who knew her from her Miami years found genuinely startling. Not performing religion for the parole board, practicing it, privately, with what appeared to be genuine engagement. What she was thinking during those 19 years is not documented. She did not give interviews from prison. She did not write a memoir. The internal life of Griselda Blanco during the years of her incarceration is a blank that nobody has been able to fill because she chose to keep it blank. What happened outside, while she was inside, is not blank. The 3 sons she had with Carlos Trujillo, Dixon, Uber, and Osvaldo were all dead before their mother was released from prison. Osvaldo was killed in 1992, Uber in 1992 as well, Dixon in 1993. All 3 died in Colombia. All 3 died in circumstances connected to the criminal world their mother had built and drawn them into. The specific details of each death vary: one shooting, one ambush, circumstances that were never fully investigated, but the pattern is consistent. The sons of Griselda Blanco died violently, in their 20s and 30s, in a country where their mother's name was either a shield or a target, depending on who was doing the shooting. It was mostly a target by then. The empire that had made the name powerful was dismantled. The organization that had generated the fear was gone. What remained was the name and the resentments it carried. The families of the hundreds of people Griselda had ordered killed, the rival traffickers who had survived the Miami wars and had long memories, the specific Colombian physics of debt and revenge that does not expire just because the person who incurred it is in an American federal prison. Her sons paid debts she had generated. They paid with their lives. She was in prison when each of them died, and she received the news in the way of someone who had long since accepted that the world she had built would consume the people she loved. Only Michael Corleone survived. She landed in Medellín in 2004. The plane touched down at José María Cordova International Airport on a Tuesday morning, and Griselda Blanco stepped onto Colombian soil for the first time in nearly 30 years. She was 61 years old. She had entered American federal custody as the most feared cocaine trafficker in the Western Hemisphere. She was leaving it as a deportee, a woman the United States government had processed, punished, and expelled, the way you expel something the body is finished with. There was no reception committee, no former associates waiting with cars, no ceremony of any kind. Whatever remained of her network had long since reorganized around other leadership, other supply lines, other names. The cocaine economy of the 1980s had been replaced by the cocaine economy of the 1990s and then the 2000s. Larger, more diffuse, structured differently, managed by organizations that had learned from the Miami wars and made adjustments. The Medellín cartel that Pablo Escobar had built was gone. Escobar himself killed in 1993, shot on a rooftop in Medellín the day after his 44th birthday. The Cali cartel that had replaced it was dismantled by the mid-1990s. The trafficking world Griselda had helped create had continued evolving without her, as it always does, as markets always do. She was, in the specific language of the criminal world she had spent her life inhabiting, yesterday. She found a house in Medellín. She kept a low profile. She went to church. She cooked. She had, by most accounts of people in her neighborhood during those final 8 years, the surface appearance of an ordinary, elderly Colombian woman living out her retirement in a modest home in a city that had more history with violence than almost any other place on earth. Whether the surface reflected anything real underneath it is a question nobody can answer. Michael Corleone Blanco visited her during those years. He was in his 20s by the time she was deported, a young man who had grown up inside the specific catastrophe of being Griselda Blanco's son, who had been present nearby when his father was murdered at age 3, who had spent his childhood moving between Miami and Colombia as circumstances demanded, who had watched his 3 older brothers die before he was old enough to fully understand what their deaths meant. In interviews he gave after her death, on American television programs, in print profiles connected to the Netflix dramatization of her life, Michael Corleone described his mother with a complexity that resists simple summary. He acknowledged the murders. He acknowledged the destruction. He did not minimize what she had done or attempt to construct a defense of it. He also described a woman who made him food, who held him when he was frightened, who was present in his life in the specific domestic ways that the word mother implies, even as she was simultaneously ordering people killed in the streets outside. He said he loved her. He said he missed her. He said that growing up with her as a mother had made it impossible for him to explain his childhood to anyone who had not lived something similar, that the emotional reality of it did not map onto the categories that people outside that world used to make sense of things. She was not a monster to him. She was his mother. The two things existed simultaneously, and he had spent his adult life learning to hold both without resolving the contradiction, because the contradiction did not resolve. This is perhaps the most precise thing anyone has ever said about Griselda Blanco. She was not a monster in the way that the word is usually meant, something alien, something outside the human range, something that can be studied from a safe distance without recognition. She was a human being who had grown up in conditions of real deprivation and real violence, who had survived those conditions by developing capacities that would have been sociopathic in any other context, but were functionally adaptive in hers, and who had then deployed those capacities in the construction of an empire that killed approximately 250 people across 2 continents over 4 decades. 250. That is the conservative estimate, the number that investigators were able to connect with reasonable confidence to her organization during her operational years. The actual number is almost certainly higher. Many of the deaths in Miami during the Cocaine Cowboy era were never properly investigated, never attributed, swallowed by the sheer volume of bodies that Dade County was processing in those years. The medical examiner's office was running at crisis capacity. Cases that would have received full investigative resources in a normal year were processed minimally and closed. The full accounting of what Griselda Blanco produced will never be completed. September 3, 2012, the morning she died. The butcher shop was called Carniceria Cardizo. It was in the Belen neighborhood, working class, dense, the kind of neighborhood that Medellín has thousands of, where people live close together and know each other's business and keep their doors open in the morning because the heat requires it. She had been living in the area for several years. She was known there as an older woman, quiet, religious. The butcher knew her by name. She came in that morning at her usual time. She bought meat. She paid. She said something to the butcher. The accounts vary on whether it was a pleasantry about the weather or something else, the way accounts always vary on the small details surrounding significant moments. She walked out carrying a white plastic bag. The motorcycle was at the far end of the street. 2 men, moving at the pace of people who were not worried about being stopped. She may have seen it coming. The specific instinct that had kept her alive for 69 years, the paranoia, the constant environmental scanning, the trained ability to read threat before it arrived, may have registered something in those last seconds. There is no way to know. The accounts from people who saw it happen describe events moving too quickly for that kind of interpretation. 2 shots, both to the head. She was dead before she hit the ground. The motorcycle turned the corner and was gone. Nobody was ever charged with her murder. The Colombian authorities investigated. They identified possible suspects, individuals connected to criminal organizations operating in Medellín, who had historical reasons to want Griselda Blanco dead. Several theories circulated: that it was revenge carried out on behalf of families of people she had killed during her operational years, that it was connected to disputes over money or property that had persisted through her years in prison and her return to Colombia, that it was ordered by a current trafficking organization that wanted to eliminate even the symbolic presence of someone associated with the old order. None of these theories was ever proven in court. No arrest was made. The case remains officially unsolved. In the context of Griselda Blanco's life, an unsolved murder feels less like an anomaly and more like a closing rhyme. The Netflix series premiered in January 2024, 12 years after her death. Sofia Vergara played Griselda, a casting choice that generated significant commentary because Vergara is primarily known for comedic work and Griselda Blanco is not a comedic subject. The series was produced by Eric Newman, who had also produced Narcos, and it approached Blanco's story with the same stylized, drama-forward aesthetic that had made Narcos a global phenomenon. It became one of the most watched series on the platform in its first month of release. Millions of people who had been born after the Cocaine Cowboy era, who had no personal memory of the bodies in the shopping malls, or the refrigerated trucks behind the medical examiner's office, or the Time magazine cover that declared Miami a lost paradise. Those people watched the series and encountered Griselda Blanco for the first time as a character, as a figure of fascination, as someone whose life, dramatized and compressed and aestheticized, generated the specific combination of horror and admiration that the true crime genre runs on. This is its own phenomenon, worth examining directly. We make icons out of people like Griselda Blanco. We always have. Al Capone, Pablo Escobar, El Chapo. The names accumulate, each one attached to a body count and a mythology, each one generating documentaries and streaming series and merchandise and the particular cultural product of infamy transformed into entertainment. The machinery for this transformation is well established and operates with reliable efficiency. Take a person who did monstrous things, find the human elements of their story, dramatize the arc from poverty to power to fall, and deliver it to an audience that can consume it from a position of safety, at the distance of a screen, with the knowledge that it ended 30 years ago. The question that the machinery rarely pauses to ask is what this says about us. Not about Griselda, about us. Why does the story of a woman who ordered 250 murders become entertainment? What does it mean that we watch it, that we find her fascinating, that the streaming numbers for her story climb into the tens of millions, while the names of her victims remain largely unknown? There is no documentary about Germán Jiménez Paneso, the man killed at Dadeland Mall. There is no streaming series about the families of the people whose bodies filled those refrigerated trucks in 1981. The perpetrator gets the biography. The victims get the body count statistic, mentioned once, in passing, to establish scale. This is not unique to Griselda. It is the grammar of how we tell these stories. But Griselda's story makes the grammar more visible than most, perhaps because she is a woman, because the specific fascination she generates carries an additional charge, the charge of violated expectation. We expect violence at this scale from men. When a woman produces it, the fascination intensifies. We look harder. We try to understand more completely. We want to know what made her. What made her was poverty. What made her was violence visited upon her before she had the capacity to resist it. What made her was a specific social and historical context. Mid-20th century Colombia, the comunas of Medellín, the complete absence of any legitimate path to power or security for a girl born into nothing, that created the conditions in which her specific combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and strategic thinking could develop in only one direction. None of this excuses what she did. 250 people are dead. Families were destroyed. A city was traumatized. The consequences of her operation radiated outward in ways that are still being felt. In the drug policies that the Miami wars produced, in the enforcement apparatus that was built in response to her, in the specific institutional damage that a decade of open warfare does to a city's sense of itself. She made choices. She was responsible for those choices. And she was also the product of a world that made those choices available to her before any others were. The legacy she left is not simple to categorize. On one level, it is purely destructive. The body count, the institutional damage, the families of the dead, whose grief did not end when Griselda was arrested, did not end when she was deported, did not end when she was shot outside a butcher shop in Belén. Grief does not have an expiration date. The children of the people she killed grew up without parents. Some of them are still alive. Some of them probably watched the Netflix series. On another level, the level that is harder to discuss without sounding like you are celebrating something that should not be celebrated, she changed things. She changed how cocaine was trafficked into the United States. introducing operational innovations that the organizations that came after her built upon and refined. She changed the economics of South Florida, generating so much cash that it measurably altered the region's banking system and arguably funded much of the construction boom that transformed Miami from a mid-sized American city into a global metropolis. She changed American drug policy, providing the images and the body count that gave the Reagan administration the political mandate for the war on drugs escalation that would define the 1980s and 1990s. She changed the career trajectory of dozens of law enforcement officials who built their professional reputations pursuing her. She changed the organizational culture of the DEA, which learned from the Centak 26 investigation how to construct a major conspiracy case against a sophisticated trafficking network. She changed the legal framework for money laundering prosecution, as her case was used by federal prosecutors to develop and refine techniques that are still in use. She changed Miami itself. The city that exists today, the skyline, the real estate market, the financial sector, the specific cosmopolitan character of a place that draws money and people from across Latin America and the world, is, in ways that are uncomfortable to fully acknowledge, built partly on a foundation of cocaine money. Griselda Blanco's operation was a significant source of that money. The buildings are real. The money that built them was real. The people it killed to generate it were real. This is the specific vertigo of Griselda Blanco's legacy. That the destruction and the construction happened simultaneously. That the same operation that filled the medical examiner's refrigerated trucks also funded the economic transformation of a major American city. And that there is no clean way to separate these things from each other. Pablo Escobar was shot and killed on December 2, 1993, on a rooftop in Medellín, the day after his 44th birthday. Griselda Blanco outlived him by 19 years. She outlived the Medellín cartel. She outlived the Cali cartel. She outlived the specific era of Colombian cocaine trafficking that she had helped create. The era of spectacular, public, theatrical violence, of car bombs and shopping mall massacres, and politicians assassinated in broad daylight. The organizations that came after learned to be quieter, more corporate, less cinematically violent, not because they had become less dangerous, but because the theatrical violence had attracted consequences. American extradition treaties, military cooperation, the specific political will that gets generated when the violence becomes too visible to ignore. They had learned, in other words, from what happened to Griselda. She died in a city that was trying, imperfectly and with mixed results, to become something other than what it had been during the years she helped define it. Medellín in 2012 was not Medellín in 1975. The cable cars climbing the hillside comunas, the urban renewal projects, the transformation of Pablo Escobar's former properties into tourist destinations. These were all evidence of a city in active negotiation with its own history, trying to build something sustainable on top of ground that was soaked in blood. She died in the butcher shop neighborhood of that city, shot by a method she had invented, on a Tuesday morning when she had gone out to buy meat. There is a photograph taken sometime in the early 1980s during the height of Griselda's power in Miami. The exact date is uncertain. It shows her at what appears to be a social gathering, well-dressed, composed, holding a glass. She is looking directly at the camera with an expression that is difficult to read. Not hostile, not warm, something in between, or something that is neither. The eyes are very steady. The posture is relaxed in the specific way of someone who is never entirely relaxed. She looks like a woman who knows exactly what she is and has long since made peace with it. She looks like a woman who would be dead before 70 and knew it, and had decided that the life she had built was worth the ending it would require. She looks like someone you would not want to be in a room with. She looks also, unmistakably, like a person. That is the thing the photograph will not let you avoid. She is not a symbol. She is not an abstraction. She is not a representation of anything except herself. A specific woman, born in a specific place, in a specific year, into specific conditions, who made specific choices and produced specific consequences, and died on a specific morning on a specific street in Medellín, carrying a bag of meat. The motorcycle appeared at the end of the street. 2 shots, both to the head. She invented this.